I'd like to frame this session number 10 in the arc of the regional dialogues. I note that last month's session 9 was around risk as well and argued that ocean and coastal accounts need to integrate disaster risk. Session 7 looked at governance structures. And session 5 made the case for social and cultural values to be captured in ocean accounts. Session 10 now addresses what sits underneath all three of these things, the evidence to decision gap. The fact that even well-designed governance frameworks fail when the evidence that should inform them doesn't actually reach the decision point. We have two panelists today to explore these with us, and I'll hand over to Cara to introduce our panelists and to frame the topic a little bit more for today. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Troy, and good day, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I would like to thank you very much to Professor Dilanthi and also Dr. Zahir for joining us today. As we can see, Troy has already set the broader context and linking to our previous sessions. So I want to start directly with the question at the heart of our discussion for today's topic. When we talk about compound risk, the difficulty is not simply that we have multiple hazards happening at the same time. It is also that those risks interact. For example, we have flooding may interact with infrastructure failure. We have sea level rise with land subsidence, extreme weather with poverty, urban development, ecosystem degradation, or even vulnerable communities. And once of those interaction begins, we can see that looking at each risk individually is no longer giving us like the full picture. But unfortunately, our governance system are still often organized that way, which is either by sector, and then we can have like by agency, by mandate, and sometimes even by individual hazard. So one institutions may have flood data and another may have like some information on land use informations. Another infrastructure records, and then researchers usually have the models, and communities themselves may have these decades of knowledge, because they live there about how these risks actually are changing locally. So we may therefore have a lot of information, but it not necessarily means that the system is capable of capturing this and also seeing all these things as a whole risk altogether. And I think this is where today's conversation begins particularly interesting. And we have two esteemed panelists with us today. And also because I don't want to only focus on what either like do we actually need more data, but there are other things that we really need to see. So some of the questions that maybe I hope we can have like in our mind currently is like, where do this evidence to decision chain actually breaks? And is there a problem that evidence does not exist? The fragmentation across institutions or some of knowledge recognized by others that are excluded. I'll explain the flow for today. We will begin with approximately 10 minutes from each of our panelists to give their perspective. And then we'll begin with Professor Dilanthi and then Dr. Zahir to join in discussions. And I very much want this conversation to be, not a two separate presentation because we have two perspectives here that is highly complementary. Professor Dilanthi brings the institutional disaster risk and built environment perspective, while Dr. Zahir brings the perspective of the scientist and engineer actually producing coastal risk evidence and trying to translate it into practical interventions. So we will then open the discussion to question. Please feel free to send your question through the Q&A box. We'll pick it up and ask to the panelists. So you don't have to wait until the end for you to start, writing some of these questions. So let us begin with the first presenter. Before that, I will introduce her. Professor Amaratunga is one of the world's most cited scholars in built environment disaster resilience, ranked first in the UK as a highly ranked scholar in the built environment and consistently among the top 2% of global scientists. Her research spans multi-hazard and compound disaster risk, climate change, urban vulnerability, and the governance of post-disaster recovery, grounded in a commitment to interdisciplinary and integrated approaches across the built and natural environment. She has secured over 30 major international research grants exceeding 30 million pounds with 288 partners across 57 countries. And her landmark project spans disability inclusive disaster risk reduction in Indonesia, post-tsunami community relocation in Sri Lanka, multi-hazard early warning system, and nature-inspired solutions for coastal disaster risk. Crucially for this session, her work consistently confronts the questions of why compound risk evidence, even when technically rigorous, fails to reach or influence governance frameworks and what institutional architecture is needed to change that. She is an advisor to multiple international agencies and a recognized leader on the translation of disaster science into policy. In this dialogue, she brings her sustained focus on how built environment evidence travels or does not travel into national and subnational disaster governance in South and Southeast Asia context. Prof. Dilanthi, very delighted to have you with us. May I invite you to begin your opening remarks?
Thank you very much, Dr. Smile. So, will you be sharing my slides?
Yes, Troy, please share the first slide. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much for sort of having me for this session, and then I really appreciate the invite. And then I think it's a very, very important topic, this compound risk, as we all know, and you set the scene very well. We actually we don't actually see hazards actually coming towards us in isolation. They come actually as a kind of a package, whether we like it or not. So in that sense, I think there need to be a way of actually dealing with it from different perspectives, and then it is actually good to see that you have actually picked up this very valid topic today, which is actually to do with why evidence fails to reach decisions in South Asia in particular, and also linking with governance. So that is actually the so answering this question why, that is what I'm going to touch base upon today. So can you move to the next slide, please? Okay, so this is actually, I like this UN diagram, which actually explains to us what the problem that we are facing in quite a bit of detail. You can actually sort of see the cascading or the triggering hazards coming to us, kind of how demonstrating how the hazards interact, and also it has kind of the compound nature, and also the link with that is the amplification. So this is actually, I see this as a very, very good way of sort of illustrating the multi-hazard approach and the systematic risk associated with that. So in that sense, I suppose disasters often cascade, amplify, or compound, creating impacts far more severe than a single hazard alone. That is the reality that we face. That is the challenge that we all need to be find solutions for as academics, researchers, and also the policymakers. So in that sense, the compound disaster risk where multiple hazard events overlap or cascade, for example, intense monsoonal flooding, which coincides with rapid urban subsidence, heat waves, or critical infrastructure failure, are accelerating, particularly across South Asia. It is actually not only a problem in South Asia, but since this session is particularly built around South Asian context, I have actually tried to bring the examples around South Asia. So in that sense, while researchers across physical sciences, social sciences, and engineering disciplines generate extensive data. That is what the researchers do always, as we all know. This evidence, I think it is fair to say, frequently fails to inform governance and the policy. So there's a major gap between what is developed or found out, explored by the researchers, and the transfer of that information to policy for policymakers, so that they can use that information towards policy making as inputs. Thank you. Next slide, please. So in that sense, what I have done is, of course, there are so many reasons that we can cite for this gap. But what I have done is I have actually categorized them under 4 major headings. So this is actually the first topic. I say that there are institutional silos and fragmented mandates. This is one of the reasons why there's a gap exists. So departmental isolation, I think this is very, very common in South Asia. I have actually come across this gap in all my research. For example, government bodies typically operate particularly in South Asia, typically operate in single hazard or single sector mandates. It is actually the reality, whether we like it or not. For example, water resource ministries, urban planning authorities, disaster management agencies rarely share real-time data or joint planning protocols. Sadly, this is the situation. So this is actually demonstrates the institutional silos. So the second point that I want to highlight under this topic is actually the focus on reactive emergency response than proactive planning. This is sadly again the situation within these institutions. Disaster management frameworks in the region remain heavily biased towards disaster relief and response. There's absolutely no argument about it. Even though that institutions talk about the need to have pre-disaster risk reduction and long-term planning, the front facing action is actually based around disaster relief and response. Because the reason for that is the funding streams are tied to active emergencies, multidimensional risk assessments are sidelines because of that. Always the funding is actually geared towards emergencies. So this is actually the first gap that I want to highlight, which is institutional silos and fragmented mandates. Next slide, please. Second key gap that I want to highlight is actually this disconnectedness across physical built environment and the social data. For example, relating to that, there are two topics that I want to highlight. The first one is actually the data in the incompatibility of the data sets. What do you mean by that? For example, physical hazard monitoring, such as meteorological and hydrological data, built environment tracking, such as infrastructure age, structural codes, land use zoning, for example, and social vulnerability data. Poverty metrics, healthcare access, informal settlement mapping are very much stored as isolated data sets, which are managed by different institutions with incompatible data standards. Sadly, this actually demonstrates a major data gap, so incompatible data sets. And the second point that I want to highlight is actually relating to the underrepresentation of built environment and social dimensions. Formal disaster risk databases, as we all know, oversubscribed by the data relating to physical metrics such as rainfall, earthquake magnitude, sea level rise, and so on and so forth, or immediate losses such as death tolls, destroyed property, and so on and so forth. Whereas indirect, systemic, and cascading social impacts such as post-flood disease outbreaks, informal settlement displacement data, or loss of informal livelihoods. They are very rarely identified or quantified in forms that influence budget allocation. That is another major gap that I want to highlight. So disconnect across physical, built, and social data. These sectors do not speak to each other. Thank you. Next slide, please. So the third gap that I want to highlight is actually relating to science, policy, and epistemological misalignment. The meaning of that is that there's a gap between actionability and granularity of data. For example, research on compound risk often relies on high-level climate models, as we all know, macroeconomic estimates, or broad theoretical frameworks. That is what we as researchers develop all the time. Whereas decision makers, such as city mayors, district magistrates, and so on and so forth, they require hyper-local scenario mapping. Of course, so in that sense, there's a gap between these models and how the policymakers can apply them in the real life scenario. So there's a gap between how the policymakers see what we do as researchers. So that is actually I label that as actionability gap. And the second point is lack of knowledge translation hubs. This is actually a major issue in most of the South Asian countries. For example, unlike regions with institutionalized scientific advisory mechanisms, whereas where I live in the UK, we have actually major institutions where their main role is to provide scientific advisory. In that sense, South Asia lacks, in my view, intermediary institutions such as those which are dedicated to translating complex multi-hazard modeling into actionable policy briefs, code updates, or budget line items. So the second point is directly linked to the first one that I highlighted in terms of actionability gaps. So this is actually the third key reason that I want to highlight relating to why there's a major gap in data and the actionable policies. Next one, please, my final point. The final key point that I want to highlight is actually relating to political economy and short-term incentives. For example, sadly, the electoral cycles versus long-term compound risk actually exist. I think there are a lot of evidences that have been identified through the research to justify this. For example, mitigating compound risk, in my view, requires long-term investments in ecosystem restoration, strict land use enforcement, and resilient urban infrastructure. However, politically, visible short-term relief projects or quick grey infrastructure construction yield faster electoral returns than preventative cross-sectional planning. As we know, within the local scenarios, the cycle of governance is quite small. Generally, it's about 3 to 4 years. That sort of a cycle is actually not enough to actually capture the needs of the society. And the second sub-point that I want to emphasize is relating to enforcement and code compliance deficits. Even when physical and built environment data inform stricter building codes or floodplain regulations, for example, local political economic pressures such as rapid unorganized urbanization and weak regulatory enforcement lead to widespread non-compliance. So this is again to do with this very short political economy cycles. So those are actually the four key areas that I want to highlight as the reasons for this problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Dilanthi. I think even it's only 4, there's a lot to unpack, and that sort of like summarize a lot of things that we have to share later on for the discussion. So I guess we move to the next speaker. I'll introduce Dr. Zahir first. Associate Professor Muhammad Zahir bin Ramli is a coastal engineer and marine scientist whose work focuses on generating and translating evidence for complex coastal and climate risks, trained in Tokai University and Yokohama National University in Japan. He obtained his PhD in fluid structure interaction from the University of Southampton. His expertise spans physical oceanography, hydrodynamic and wave modeling, shoreline change, storm surge, coastal flooding, and nature-inspired coastal protection. His research examines how multiple hazards interact across spatial and temporal scales, including the convergence of sea level rise, extreme waves, monsoon and typhoon events, sediment dynamics, shoreline erosion, and urban inundation. So he has undertaken modeling and applied research across Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Thailand, including multi-scale flood assessment in Kuala Terengganu, Malaysia, studies on Storm Pabuk and Typhoon Rai, and regional sea level rise projection using CMIP scenarios. Beyond hazard modeling, his work addresses the challenges of converting technical evidence into practical and locally appropriate interventions. He lead research on hybrid coastal protection system, including dune-like concepts and sediment trapping structures as alternatives or complements to conventional hard engineering approaches. His community-facing work on beach safety, coastal awareness, and marine debris along the Pahang coast of Malaysia also informs his understanding on how local knowledge and lived experience can strengthen formal risk assessment. Through his engagement with Science Policy Network, he brings to this dialogue the perspective of an evidence producer an applied practitioner, someone who develops compound risk models, work with communities and institutions, and regularly confronts the gap between what available data reveals and what decision makers can use and what governments ultimately choose to implement. So let me invite you to give your perspective. Dr. Zahir, over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, my voice is clear.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I think you can also share my slide. And I'm sorry I didn't have the first introduction slide like Prof. Dilanthi. But however, thank you for the opportunity here to be part of this important dialogue on the compound risk and the data gap. So across because I'm going to follow up points given by Prof. Dilanthi, and I think it's relate much to what I've been practicing, because we know across Southeast Asia, particularly coastal communities, are rarely exposed to a single hazard in isolation. Flooding may result from the interaction of extreme rainfall, and then we have river discharge, high tides, we have storm surge, wave, land subsidence, shoreline erosion, inadequate drainage, rapid and of course rapid urban development. So all this physical hazard may then combine with social and institutional vulnerabilities, including informal settlements, aging infrastructure, limited government capacity, fragmented responsibilities, and unequal access to resources. So all these points, all these multi-hazard actually relate much to the points that have been elaborated by Prof. Dilanthi on long-term investment, weak regulatory enforcement. So it really resonates much to what I've been doing as a coastal engineer and also as a marine scientist. So much of my work focuses on producing the quantitative evidence used to understand this risk. We develop numerical models in order to trace hazards across different scales, from offshore wave and how it be transformed into storm surge through nearshore hydrodynamics and shoreline changes, to coastal and of course to the urban inundation. So, but however, the more sophisticated our models become, the more clearly we see that the main challenge is not always the modeling part on the technology itself. Sometimes the challenge is often the evidence that goes into the model, how that evidence is the data, the evidence is governed, and whether the results eventually reach decision makers in a form that they can be used. Of course, like Prof. Dilanthi also mentioned, we have an extensive lot of data, but how that data going to be used to inform to influence the governance itself. And the first major issues as a coastal engineer itself will be one of the issues is institutional fragmentation. For example, some data on the bathymetry may be held by one agency, tide records by another, land use information sometimes by a local authority, and infrastructure data by utility providers, and of course some environmental surveys by individual project proponents or consultants. So many studies, we have a lot of extensive data funded for different type of project, and the resulting data sometimes considered the property of the organization that commissioned them. So sometimes are not intended to be used for wider use or to be shared. And these also relate to the point by isolated database, also that being mentioned earlier, because rarely it being shared for a wider use that can be used for inform the governments. And in some cases, organizations are also cautious about releasing some data because some fear that the information may expose weaknesses, create liabilities or later be used against what have been decided earlier. As a result, some agency may collect only the minimum data required to fulfill its own mandate or approval process, and this one we can talk later in the discussion. This may be sufficient to complete one study or to satisfy one regulatory requirement, but it does not create a complete and reusable evidence base for understanding the compound risks. So the outcome sometimes is a patchwork of data sets collected at different times using different methods, resolutions, coordinate system, and quality standards. So even when all the information can be accessed, integrating it into one coherent model can be extremely difficult. Okay, next slide, please. So to get a long term from evidence to decision, we need sometimes a long-term record that are particularly important, but particularly difficult to obtain, like tide gauge data, for example, essential to understand the sea level trend, but the records may be incomplete for some local like a hyperlocal scenario mapping, like Prof. Dilanthi mentioned, or discontinued due to budget restriction, restricted due to different agency, or too short to distinguish the long-term change from natural variability. So the final model of some modeling work therefore appear integrated, but it is often constructed from uneven evidence, where data are missing, where we, the modeler, must use a lot of interpolation, simplify some scenario, or rely on regional and global data sets. So this assumption are, we know, necessary, but they are also introduce uncertainty that may not always be visible to the decision maker that receive the final map or the engineering recommendation. And another issue will be the relationship between technical modeling and community knowledge, the gap between the two. We know that numerical models are powerful, but they do not capture every dimension of risk. One model may focus on wave, another on erosion, another on a different type of perspective. Ecological impact, we have access through community behavior, seasonal pattern. Maybe some part will may fall outside the model entirely. So this is why we believe that there's a meaningful stakeholders of engagement are essential that need to be linked between translating the complex multi-hazard, like what been mentioned earlier, into a more actionable policy brief. But how to achieve this? Of course, community knowledge can help us to improve the modeling approach, and of course to direct the focus towards what the impact that was more severe than the modeling can only predict. So with this simple reference points, sometimes we know that some community evidence sometimes being often dismissed as anecdotal. To change the community should be supported to document their observation in consistent and structured way. So this can be used to reach the decision maker, and we will talk more on in our discussion later, and somehow can be used to create basic monitoring tools where local knowledge can become longitudinal evidence that support model validation and formal decision making. So in my point of view, just to as a short remark, government agency, university, NGO, consultant, industry players, and community all hold different parts of evidence and data, and we need the real leverage point lies in creating trusted mechanism to share those evidence, assess it, preserve it, and ensure that it reaches the level where decisions are made. The central question for this session is therefore not simply whether we have enough data, is it whether the data that we already have and the knowledge held by communities can cross institutional, technical, and political boundaries in time to change the outcome. So I look forward to exploring this question with the audience and Prof. Dilanthi and with all of you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zahir. I think that representation shows like very clearly that producing compound risk evidence already requires us to bring together multiple data sets. So that's already like, just not like it's already multiple hazards, and also you have like different data set itself to fit into the model, and how this model is actually, it can be uneven because of depending on what evidence that we feed into the model itself. So if there is some data that is not there, the model is definitely can be lopsided to certain parameters that we are required, or some of the parameters that might have more data than whatever the others do not have. So I guess now it brings us together into the discussion for both panels. So I would like to first direct a question to Prof. Dilanthi. Thank you so much for the talk that you gave just now. And I think you've already listed down like some of the very key important things that we need to discuss within this session. So perhaps the first question would be, why is built environment evidence so consistently missing from compound disaster risk governance frameworks, and what would it take to put it at the center? I guess everyone sort of like in the ecosystem know this, but it's actually like, so how do we actually move forward, and what is like the responsibility for each of the stakeholders to move it together to the center? Yeah. So perhaps that would be the first question for you, Prof.
I think it is really, really important that we address this question. I think it's a very, very important point, actually, Dr. Ismail. I think I suppose we understand to some extent what the problem is, but then the issue is, I suppose, how we can actually get out of it. So in that sense, I suppose, I think it is fair to sort of say the physical built environment comprising roads, drainage, energy grids, building stock, and informal settlements actually acts as primary medium through which physical hazard translate into human and economic disasters. We all know that, don't we? Yet, compound disaster risk governance frameworks, in my view, continuously treat the built environment as a passive backdrop or a post-disaster damage metric rather than an active risk modifier. That is where the gap is. So my intervention is actually based on what are the reasons for that sort of a misinterpretation. So in that sense, again, for the sake of understanding and in capturing the actual reasons, I have actually structured my the reasons as why under four areas, and I will actually cover them in brief. The first one is actually I suppose I label it as the asset counting bias. The meaning of that is disaster management frameworks traditionally view the built environment through a static post-event accounting lens. We all know that, don't we? For example, how many bridges collapsed, how many houses were damaged, and so on and so forth. This treats physical assets as passive objects that that will be damaged by hazards, completely missing how infrastructure actively multiplies the cascading risk beforehand. That is the very important point that I want to highlight. Okay, and the point two that I want to highlight as in response to this question, why, is the static engineering codes versus dynamic climate realities. Building and infrastructure standards, as we know, across developing and middle income regions rely heavily on historical single hazard return periods. This is actually the reality. For example, 1 in 50-year flood levels. Or it could well be in a tsunami situation, 1 year, 100-year tsunami levels. They fail to account, in my view, for compound interaction effects such as urban heat islands, weakening concrete structures alongside localized flooding, because of these engineering codes are revised infrequently, evidence on structural degradation and material limits rarely enters real-time disaster planning. So there's a major gap between static engineering codes with dynamic climate reality. So I have actually given you that example to justify my point there. So the third point that I want to highlight is relating to the informal settlement data void. A significant portion, as we know, of the built environment is rapidly expanding. Region exists outside formal municipal records. People actually move around to informal settlements as a result of disasters. As we all know, that it could well be natural hazards, or it could well be due to the conflicts and so on and so forth. In that sense, there are a high number of unregistered settlements, informally modified drainage pathways, and non-engineered housing stocks, which are not visible in official data sets. Since governance frameworks depend on official administrative inputs, the built environment where vulnerability is highest is precisely where data is least available. So in most of the data sets, the data associated with informal settlements aren't counted due to this reason. And I have given you the specific example. And of course, I think relating to informal settlements, we can actually reflect on so many examples across the region, but I wanted to highlight just one in justifying that point. And the fourth point that I want to highlight is relating to fragmented institutional jurisdictions. And I think I highlighted that in my initial intervention also. For example, in most cities, no single agency owns the built environment. That is the reality. Public works, transportation authorities, housing boards, energy distribution companies, and municipal corporations operate independently. Sadly, that is the reality. Disaster management agencies lack, in that sense, the statutory authority to audit or enforce structural risk limits across these separate infrastructure silos. This is the reality that the region faced from the point of view of fragmented institutional jurisdictions. So in that sense, I highlighted why built environment evidence is systematically missing under 4 topics. Just to highlight, the first one is actually relating to the asset counting bias, and the second point relating to the gap in static engineering codes, and the third point was relating to informal settlements data void, and final point was fragmented institutional jurisdictions. So in that sense, well, we know what the problems are, then what it takes to put the built environment at the center. There need to be solutions. So I'm actually coming up with some suggestions that the sector can actually count in solving these problems. So again, around the four points that I highlighted, I will actually suggest some solutions, perhaps that we can count on under the same 4 areas. For example, the first one is shift from static maps to dynamic multi-infrastructure digital twins. That is one option that we can actually identify as a solution. For example, we need to move beyond static GIS maps towards real-time digital models, for example, which actually map interdependencies and cascading failure points across water, energy, transport, and housing networks during a compound event. That needs doing. For example, we can simulate how storm surges affect urban substations and emergency access routes simultaneously. That can be done. Okay, so that is actually one solution that I want to put forward. The second one is to do with establishing built environment risk budgets in urban master planning. There needs to be a capital expenditure to comprehensively to carry out multi-hazard risk assessments. For example, infrastructure projects should be evaluated not just on immediate cost, in my view, but on whether they increase or reduce the spatial exposure of surrounding areas. That needs doing. And the third option that I want to put forward is to do with integrating informal built environments via participatory spatial mapping. Again, I highlighted that as a major gap, and this is actually the solution that I want to put forward. Bridge the official data gap in informal settlements. What we can do is we can utilize high resolution satellite imagery combined with community-led group mapping. We can document informal drainage modifications, for example, structural vulnerabilities and local adaptations to reflect the true physical reality on the ground. So that is actually one of the solutions that I want to put forward. And the last point that I want to highlight is to do with providing a mandated performance-based adaptive infrastructure standards for the local authorities. We need to replace static building codes with dynamic performance standards that explicitly mandate resistance to concurrent hazards. For example, building materials rated for combined extreme heat and flood exposure. That can be done with statutory review cycles within every 3 to 5 years. Reflecting on building codes every 25 years is not going to work, particularly in a scenario that we are talking about here. So in that sense, my key takeaway is that the built environment is not just where disasters happen. It is the catalyst that determines whether a natural hazard stays a localized event or escalates into a multiple systemic catastrophe. So in that sense, identifying why the problem is and what the solutions are really important. So I hope that the 4 categories that I highlighted is useful in that sense. Again, I want to highlight these are not the only options available, but I just want to give these points as a kind of a snapshot of options that are available to us in bringing built environment positively into this equation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Maybe just a bit of follow-up, because I think that is all like great suggestion and definitely something that, if we were to advise the government, it would be something that definitely most of us here who understand the situation would want for that to happen. However, if we look like into the reality, talking about like, middle income and also like perhaps developing nation, whereby there's a lot of like financial fiscal that we are talking about, like a budget of a country. Definitely the last point that you had when you were presenting were on like the long-term initiative, but often this is like, political economy. You have to look like where does the money goes, and something that when you invest for a long time project, you can't get the return immediately. So if you want to win the hearts of people, perhaps this is not something that any government or any political person would push forward. So what are some of the ways where it can be break down so that the long-term vision is to have all the 4 in place, but what are like the small wins that we can try to do in order to convince the governing system that there are things that can be done in a smaller bits and can be actually feel and also can be beneficial to either community or like anyone in the stakeholders of, definitely the communities to actually live there. So is there anything that you feel maybe if I were to do immediately, if something that I have to pitch to the government, what would I do? And looking into the context of Southeast Asia, definitely.
I think it's a very important point. In order for the communities to actually convey the message, in the first instance, the policymakers need to believe in the importance of investing in disaster risk reduction and preparedness planning. That is actually the number 1 step. So because I think, again, for political gain, the concentration is always on allocating funding for response. That is where the cameras are. Like as we all know, when a disaster happens, there's a lot of actually publicity around that, the cameras, the media. So sadly, the political entities really like to actually go to the scene, go to the scenarios, and to actually manage the response efforts, but without actually putting a lot of effort into the preparedness planning. So really speaking, in that sense, disaster literacy is extremely important in getting the policymakers to understand the importance of investing in disaster preparedness. That is extremely important, so that before a disaster happens, they need to invest in minimizing the damage. Of course, as we all know, certain disasters cannot be avoided. They are actually related to natural causes, such as earthquake. But what we can do is we can actually minimize the impact of disasters by investing in disaster preparedness. So really speaking, the first step is that the policymakers, the managers, the national level entities need to believe in the disaster preparedness concept. That is what Sendai framework is all about. That is what the Sustainable Development 2030 agenda is all about. Talking about disaster preparedness rather than the response. So that is actually the starting point. So if the policymakers don't believe in that, I don't think that we can transfer that message to the communities. So when the policymakers believe in that, then that can be translated to communities by means of various actions. So what are they? What I suggest is, again, I have actually had a PhD student working on this area as part of their PhD. For example, we can actually have incentive schemes for communities. For example, this particular research that was actually that actually explored what sort of incentives can be given to communities to incorporate disaster resilient housing when they do their houses at the very local level, how they can incorporate the disaster resilient principle, and to encourage that. Perhaps the authorities can actually give them incentives in terms of actually payments towards actually increase strength that they need in making the foundation more reliable. Some actions like that is possible. So those are actually I gave you an example where the disaster preparedness needs to be translated from national level to local level. So that is actually really important that understanding the importance of disaster preparedness compared into disaster response is the key here. Without that understanding and the belief, it will be very difficult for the communities to understand that. As I said, the policymakers need to believe in that in the first instance. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think disaster literacy is a key as well, and it has to be also included in education so that people are aware of these things, right? So going to Dr. Zahir, so perhaps more like on the data itself, we know that, like you say, when you were to do like these models, there are a lot of like data needed. And from your opinion, what is like the hardest, like where does the data gap actually bite the hardest? Is it like the missing data or inaccessibility or incompatible data set and uncertainty? Because most of these would definitely, and which one of these actually will affect what eventually reaches the decision maker? And then adding on to that, when you were to do like all these models with all this data, how do you know that the evidence is good enough for it to be then taken up to like the policymakers, like to act upon, since you are the one who's actually one of these people who provides this model. So over to you, Dr. Zahir.
Okay, thank you so much. Very good point from Prof. Dilanthi as well on the disaster literacy, because coming from an engineer who relies a lot on data, so we also have often have issues on the data gap that we believe coming from the institutional fragmentation, and also relate back to the funding itself. And most of the I believe on the problem coming like fund to disaster isolated database are rarely quantified, and you can see long-term investment. Everything's really back coming back to the funding itself, and as the political are the one who really involve have a big influence in this funding. And of course we have to how to make sure that to convince them in order to invest in the options that have been given, of course, by Prof. Dilanthi as well. And we know that different agencies, for my experience, collect and retain different data sets. And of course, we have different projects, so different project proponents, different private entities commonly treat this data sometimes as the property of their own, because they are the one that funding them, and these data are therefore not always there and intended to be used for wider use for scientists or public sharing. So in these cases, we also find out that some organization may also be reluctant to release information because they because the finding could later be used again to against them or against the project, or this is related much to the governance and create additional regulatory obligations. So for the data itself, we each as an agency tends to define its own minimum data requirement. So the priority is often to obtain enough information to satisfy a particular approval process. This when we talk about the minimum data that have been collected by different parties, just to tick the box at a specific level of decision making, rather than to build a long-term, comprehensive, and reusable evidence base. As a result, the data can be highly exclusive, remain isolated within the individual institution. And this create a patchwork of data set that are difficult to combine across agency, location, and time period. And another problem when on the data itself, when the access is granted, integration remains challenging, like bathymetry, we have topography, land use, tide data, wave sediment, infrastructure data may have been collected at a different, using different method, different spatial resolution, different periods and quality standards. The resolution is often determined by the budget allocated, the fund itself, and the objective order of the original project. So either it meant for certain industry or certain project proponents, or it meant by the government itself. So that's really differ can really actually can really have different impact on how the data is being collected, rather than by the needs of a broader compound resource assessment. So to have every data from every project that have been done to build this compound risk assessment, that could be a very challenging. And of course, I mentioned in my first intervention, the long-term data set are particularly difficult to obtain, especially like what the Dr. Khaira has mentioned on for the country, for developing country, those with a very minimum funding to install a tide gauge record, for example, that essential for detecting sea level trend, are very difficult for those country, because we need the long-term change in order for us to separate the trend from the short-term variability, and to validate coastal flood models. And we found a lot of records may be incomplete, discontinuous, restricted, and too short to support reliable analysis. So the consequences is that we found out the final model is often built on uneven evidence, and as a modeler or engineer need to interpolate the missing information, and we are the one need to rely on this global data set, which are funded by a bigger institution, or make assumption where local observation are available. So to respond to the disaster preparedness and the disaster response, we understand that, of course, the disaster preparedness are the one that needs priority. But we understand that due to the unavailable of this data, it makes it very difficult to actually develop a framework for this disaster preparedness. So what the only alternative is only the disaster response, where the data can be collected at a very short-term time, and we can respond to what the current data actually shown. So the model therefore provide a useful picture of risk, but the confidence level, the resolution may somehow being constrained by this in order to develop a very very high confident disaster preparedness to influence the government up to the government level to make sure that they incorporate it in their policy brief. So I think that's make it difficult to the developing countries whereby we wanted to show something that we have high confidence with, but even if we don't have the confidence in the data, we cannot also bring this our model in order for them to also have the same level confidence as us. So, okay, that's all for me.
Yeah, okay. So I feel like both of you touched the importance of the preparedness, but then something came to my mind, is there any, maybe Prof. Dilanthi have a lot of experience in this, there's an evidence of cost benefit, for you to prepare, this long-term effort and so on with disaster reliefs. Well, I mean, because I think some might just think that it's better to just, focus on disaster relief and also when it already happens, because, for example, tsunami doesn't happen often. So why do you need to actually, put a lot of effort into this while actually just sort of do whatever response to the hazard later. So is there an actual cost benefit analysis to see that it's important for you to do this preparedness and it's actually save you a lot more than doing it later with relief and also with response? Prof. Dilanthi, any opinion?
I think that can be done, but of course, I think you took the tsunami example. I agree with you. It is actually very rare, but when it happens, the impact is actually unimaginable. So in that sense, I suppose what needs doing is, I suppose, taking action again tsunamis. But again, this actually takes us back to the concept of multi-hazard. So none of the countries are in a position to actually invest only on single hazard basis, and we identify that as a weakness. So what is needed now, and then what is actually happening in the region is even the tsunami preparedness systems, early warning systems, is embedded within the multi-hazard concept. So in that sense, the cost of preparedness is actually distributed across several other hazards as well. So in that sense, doing a kind of a cost benefit analysis in that sense is actually much better rather than taking tsunami as an isolated hazard. So that is what we need to be doing. And again, in terms of the benefits, for example, if you don't take action from a tsunami event, even though that they are actually quite rare, when it happens, we know the extent of the devastation from all perspectives. For example, from the mortality rates, there can be actually huge losses of lives, and also the economic impact. That is actually unimaginable. And the region is still suffering from 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami after 22 years. So you can actually see the long-term impact. And that is why it is actually very important to actually bring all these points into the equation. And also in that sense, you need to have the accurate early warning systems. If the early warning system fails, there will be very high level of mortality rates and also the economic impact. For example, if due to a false alarm, if you issue an early warning message, imagine the damage it does. Of course, there won't be any mortality rates, but in terms of economic impact, for example, the whole country will be shut down for a day or two. That will create a huge economic impact to the society. So in that sense, having investments in actual early warning as an example is really, really important. So in that sense, doing a cost benefit analysis is not that difficult, but from the perspective of multi-hazard systems rather than taking tsunamis as a single entity. So I wanted to explain that by bringing in tsunami as an example, but that can well be the rationale for every other hazard as well. So my answer is actually the option is actually taking all the hazards together, multi-hazard multi-hazard systems. And in that sense, I think doing a cost-benefit analysis, and again, through the disaster literacy, we should be able to, and we can educate the policymakers and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So I think we are almost at the end, but I think it's not appropriate for me not to ask anything like a question about community. So perhaps I'll just extend it to a bit more of time, if okay with both of you. On the community knowledge, so it's the same question for both of you. Have you seen that a case where in case of Dr. Zahir and also Prof. Dilanthi, where a community held knowledge, observations built over years about flooding, erosion, shoreline change, or other interacting risks actually change either the way a risk was assessed or the intervention that was proposed. So it means that basically taking into the knowledge of the community itself, and not actually from either experts or also from like policymakers and so on. So have you seen like any of these cases while both of you were doing work in any parts of the world, not just in Southeast Asia? Whoever wants to go first.
Yeah, okay. So I will again, linking with my previous intervention on tsunamis, I will do that. For example, when the tsunami actually took place in 2004, a lot of people didn't even aware of the term. So I think, and also there were kind of, but certain island nations had an idea, and also developed countries like Japan. But I'm actually here referring to sort of other entities. They weren't aware of that, but now it has changed. So the perception of communities has changed, and they know, most of the communities, they're aware how the tsunami information is cascaded down to them and where the information is coming from, and they know about the regional centers, and they know that message is coming to the national level in the first instance, and the national authorities then translate that information to them and giving them advice on evacuation and so on and so forth. And the reason for that is this continuous community engagement programs. As you know, the Indian Ocean Tsunami Early Warning System governed by UNESCO, they carry out, we call it IO wave exercises, Indian Ocean tsunami wave exercises, formally in every 2 years. So they carry out kind of community evacuation exercises every 2 years formally. So in that sense, I think that community knowledge has increased, and I think it is fair to say the coastal communities in the region, particularly in the Indian Ocean region, I think they are aware of what is happening, why it is happening, and what needs doing when there's a tsunami. So let's keep all our fingers crossed. Let's hope that there won't be a tsunami during our lifetime, or even in several lifetimes to come. But if there's going to be one, I'm hoping that the community is ready and they know what needs to be doing. So that is actually the good side of the equation that I want to highlight. The communities are aware of, and they are educated on what needs to be doing. This is just an example to demonstrate the change in the community perceptions, particularly relating to tsunamis. Thank you.
Okay, maybe
Over
Dr. Zahir, yeah. Maybe Dr. Zahir, a bit on the community based on your experience.
Okay, just to make it short, from working with both government agencies and sometimes industry players, okay, I've seen that communities often become the critical link between the government responsibility to protect people and the commercial interests of some project developers. So in some cases, industry may understate or narrowly frame certain risks, while government agency may not have sufficient sometimes staff and fund, time or technical capacity to independently investigate every concern. Usually, community-driven action can therefore provide an important check and balance by bringing this overlooked impact into the formal decision-making process. One common pathway begins when I've seen an affected community raise concern and seek support from NGO, and then the NGO will help to organize the issue, gather evidence, and connect the community with relevant experts. So this expert can assess the likely environmental, social, and technical impact of a certain development and translate the community concern into a form that the government agency and the project or the industry are more likely to recognize. So the difference is often not community knowledge alone, but the way that the knowledge is being organized supported and formalized. So one local observation combined with technical analysis, we document it in using a very proper evidence, coordinate, and then they become much harder to dismiss. And they can influence how development happen, mitigation measure, and how the government makes the decision. And in some cases, whether a development proceed as originally proposed. So this is very important for me to say that the local knowledge can be turned into a good evidence that carry administrative and political weight, as long as being transformed into a narrative that can be understood by the government and also the industrial player. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zahir. Thank you, Prof. Dilanthi again. I think I've taken a bit of time from everyone. So let me then go to the closing summary and also synthesis. Let me put together, like, I think few key message that I guess I have gained out of this conversation. First, I think we can see that the data gap is not simply a lack of data. It's also like the siloness into the fragmented of agencies, discipline, and even scales, global versus like hyper-local kind of scales. And then second, the compound risk requires us to look beyond a hazard itself. So it cannot just be one single hazard. It is definitely you have to look at it all together. And a hazard that happened like maybe 20 years ago will also have an impact to whatever hazards that will come up later. So as Prof. Dilanthi highlighted, that what happened during the tsunami in 2004 is still affecting us here now. And then third, disaster literacy, it matters because better evidence only has value if people can understand what that evidence means for them. So whether it's coming from like the policymakers, local authorities, and even communities. So disaster literacy is not only about awareness of the hazard, it is also about understanding how the risks interact and what are the uncertainty means and why do we have to be prepared for it and not just respond and also react when the hazard actually happens. So I guess I think like most of all the informations that we have, or like all of the things that we've discussed today, disaster literacy is like really one of the things that I think needs to be comprehended and also needs to be included to all of us, you know, like here in part of this world. So fourth is that evidence does not automatically become action, even when the science is so strong, even when you have like good data, good models, it has to move through institutions, mandates, and also governance levels. So evidence needs to be produced in forms that decision makers can use, but institutions also need the capacity, authority, and also incentive to act on it. And finally, maybe we need to broaden what we recognize as evidence. Community knowledge can provide long-term, place-based understanding of how risks interact and also change over time. So the challenge is not simply to consult communities, you know, once you have the plan and then you consult the community, but it actually to create pathway for which that knowledge can genuinely influence the assessment, the planning, and also the actual decisions. So I think with that, we had a very enriching conversation today. Well, to close the data, it only not requires just better data, but definitely better understanding, communication, and also stronger institutional connection and also a pathway so that this evidence can actually become an action. And always look things like, since it's compounding risk and also compounding, you know, like it's a multi-hazard, we cannot look things at like only even the cost benefit analysis cannot just be like a single hazard and also like single data or a single stakeholder. It has to be a work of everyone that is involved in this equation. So I think I would like to thank very much to all the audience today and also to Prof. Dilanthi and also Dr. Zahir for joining us. And I would definitely appreciate all the sharings. I guess I wouldn't hold you any longer. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a good day. Bye.
Bye-bye.